So good evening. Can you hear me in the back? Excellent. So first and foremost, thank you very much for taking time from your busy lives to spend an evening talking about some of the aspects of national security. And you know, the first observation I want to make is look at the microcosm of this audience. You are government individuals. You are members of the ADF. You are contractors who work for the corporate sector. You are media. You are academics. You are think tanks. The reason I highlight that is one of the things I always try to tell, and I said this when I was in government to our leadership, but as I've said it in my new life on the outside, as it were, there is no one group, there is no one technical solution to the problem sets we are dealing with. This is about how do we harness the power of a team to come together to address some really tough issues. And they're tough because there is both a technical aspect to it, but I would also argue even more challenging than the technical side of cyber and national security in the 21st century is the human capital piece, and then how do we overlay this in a democratic society in which the rights of the individual and the freedoms that we all enjoy and so many of our citizens have worked so hard to ensure we continue to benefit from remain unchecked. That is not an easy equation. And technology at times challenges us to how do we take advantage of this? At the same time, how do we ensure that we retain the values of the society that we are? So what I thought I'd do is first I want to say thank you to ASPI for letting me come down to Australia. I am very honored to have been a partner of my Australian teammates in the security services and in the ADF. It was something I believe strongly in. It was something I personally tried to make sure, hey, look, we have done some amazing things together. And when I look back, I think about aviation terror plots. I think about forestalling terrorist acts in Australia and elsewhere in the world. I think about what we have done together in Iraq, Afghanistan, what we have done to protect Australian and U.S. people on the battlefield, our citizens around the world, partnering with our friends and allies. I feel nothing but pride having been associated with the men and women, the professionals of the Australian intelligence, security, and military. And I just want to say very much thank you for many of you who are here tonight. You know, as you heard, I guess it was an interesting week. You're in the middle of your political season. Hey, we're somewhat in the middle of ours, although we don't do this in just 6 weeks. We managed to spend a couple years focused on this in our society. So as I was watching the news while I was down here, I thought to myself, well, as the director of the National Security Agency, I was called many things in the media, but I've never been called a nutter before. So to my compatriots, many of whom are here tonight, carry on. Keep driving. So what I thought I would do was I wanted to focus on 3 areas, if I could. And what I thought I'd do is talk for about 15 minutes, and then the greatest interaction, Fergus and I wanted to open it up. I said, look, the greatest value is the audience talking and us getting into a dialogue. I really cannot stand standing in front of large groups and just pontificating for hours at a time. So what I thought I would do is focus on 3 areas. The first is one that when I left government service after 37 years in uniform in the United States, I had 2 particular areas that really concern me, and I want to talk about one of them. The one I want to talk about was, what are the national security implications of technology in the 21st century? I'll only speak for my nation, I won't speak for Australia. But one of my concerns as I left our government was, quite frankly, I didn't think we were well positioned and fully understood the implications of technology in national security. That I thought in many ways we were still organized and focused on very industrial lines, that we tended to think of technology through the prism of, well, something that's produced. It might be a particular good. It might be a particular service. It might be a particular product. On the other hand, the idea of technology as an underpinning that powers a broader set of activities, I didn't think we really were working our way through this enough. And then I would argue 5G is emblematic of this to me. 5G is just what I used to say in our system, hey, it's just the wolf closest to the sled. It's emblematic of a broader set of challenges that we're going to have to deal with over time. What's the right answer for the implementation of a technology that will be a fundamental building block for a nation's economic competitiveness in this digital world that we're living in? Because 5G is not just about well, I'm going to get a better phone service, right? No, that's not the heart. 5G is going to enable us to address latency issues. We're going to be able to move massive increased amounts of data at incredible stable rates that will turn our handheld digital devices into the kinds of capabilities and functionality that we take for granted today in our laptops and our mainframes. As we think about automation, for example, as I look at my Australian teammates and I say, hey, I look at your mining industry out west, and I say to myself, your business model for many of your companies is we want to reduce costs. That means we want to pull the human element out and maximize the human element where it represents the greatest return. To automate, I need connectivity, so I need a network structure that supports automation, and I need to be able to instrumentate, access data, and analyze it. And I'm going 5G is going to be the underpinning for all of that, is one example. So how do you think about 5G as emblematic of something larger? In the United States, our theory had always been, look, the edge for us is the innovative power of our private sector. And as long as the government largely stays out of that, we're going to compete head-to-head, and we're going to compete very well. And I would argue for 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, that worked perfectly. But 5G is representative to me of, so you tell me how that strategy works when the competition is not a single foreign company. The competition is an integrated national strategy in which that foreign company is just one component. You tell me how private industry, Australia, the United States, how does a single private company compete against the integrated efforts and resources of an entire nation state? We should ask ourselves, how did we wake up one day and suddenly our industry, doesn't matter if it's Australia or the United States, is telling us we don't have an economically viable model for 5G technology. We cannot compete right now in an area where the West was at the cutting edge and in fact developed the technology, drove the global standard that codified the technology, and built the business model that profited from the technology. And yet we find ourselves in a world today where that same industry in one technical generation is saying to us, we can't compete. We've spent a lot of time in Australia. This is one area where I would argue you're ahead of us. You have made a national policy decision about what your comfort level is with the implementation of 5G technology from a foreign company. We're not quite there yet. And as important as it is to say what we are not going to do, I would argue the more important thing is, so what are we going to do? What is the alternative? How did we get ourselves in this scenario, and what are we going to do to change it? Because if we think it's bad now with 5G, I would argue it'll be even worse when 6G comes along in about 3 years. It'll be even worse when artificial intelligence, quantum, you name it. We're going to have a series of technological changes coming up that are going to be so foundational that if we don't change the dynamic, we're going to have this conversation over and over again. Gee, we used to be the leaders, but now we really don't have an economically viable alternative. And I would argue that's not a good place for our respective societies and businesses to be in. So I think we need to be asking ourselves, so how do we need to change this model? And the conclusion I have come to is it's about creating a partnership between government and the private sector that we're just not used to. That's the way some of our competition has gone. It's not a criticism of their model. It's a reflection of the reality of their model. They have opted, and in this case, I would argue China is probably the biggest example. It doesn't make them evil and it doesn't make them bad. They have stepped back and asked themselves, given this dynamic, how can we compete? And so they have built a strategy designed to allow them to compete. There's nothing wrong with that. And if I were in their shoes, I'd be doing the exact same thing, figuring out how do I compete against the West? How do I compete against those foreign companies that are outselling my own domestic businesses in some areas? So I think we need to spend a whole lot more time asking ourselves, so what do we need to do differently? Because trying to do more of the same and expecting a different result is just insane to me. And if it's 5G today, it'll be something else tomorrow. So I think we need to change the model. So that's the first point I wanted to make to all of you tonight. I think we need to think through, what does technology mean? What are its implications in national security? I would also argue about, look, this is not about a particular nation. This is not about a particular company. This is about, how does our respective nation, Australia for you, the United States for myself, how do our nations ensure their economic competitiveness in the digital technology of the 21st century? This is not about, how do we stop country A or company B? Because again, this to me boils down to, so what kind of risk are we comfortable with? Hey, if you're going to allow some entity to construct and in some ways operate, or by extension employ the means of others to impact or influence your core backbones, you better be comfortable that whatever entity is doing that for you has long-term stability, is reflective of your values, and that you can count on that should the geopolitical situation change, that you can still count on the ability of that infrastructure to operate for you. And if the answer is no to those questions, then I would argue you ought to step back and be thinking about, so maybe we need to think about an alternative. So this is not about stopping any particular nation. This is not about contesting a particular company. This is about ensuring a nation's competitive ability in the 21st century digital age. And I think another area that we need to think about is, let's not be focused on bashing a particular company or a particular country. That's not what this is about. Because again, you're going to have to deal with this with other countries and other companies over time. Right now, it happens to be China, Huawei, and 5G. But it'll be something different in the future. So I think we really need to step back and think differently about, what's the role of government, what's the role of the private sector, how do we partner together? Because in our society, you are taught from the day you are a little boy or a little girl, competition is good, competition is healthy, competition brings out the best in you and in others. Competition is to be embraced, competition is to be sought after. It's one reason I would argue why sports are so popular in both of our societies. They're a reflection in many ways of this competitive value that we have placed on ourselves. And so my view is, look, I think the goal is to make sure that the playing field is level. Once we have a level playing field, then it is up to our private sector. Okay, so now you got to compete. But the challenge right now is the playing field is not level, and it's really difficult for them to compete. And to expect them to do this on their own, I just don't think is realistic. I used to think about this when it came to defending networks, for example. I used to tell people, if you think the government's going to do this all by themselves in a democratic society, I'm not sure, for example, the only way I could defend something was to be inside it or be able to see it. Do you really want the US government inside your private network? The flip side is, I said, you really think that you can defend yourself against country X, Y, or Z all by yourself? Guys, we have got to work together to make this work. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second point segues is a little bit of an outgrowth from that, and this is this whole idea of China. Look, to me, China is not an enemy. They are not an adversary. They are a competitor. So we need to ask ourselves, how do we compete with them? That doesn't mean that what they're doing is evil, that it is bad. They are a nation state, you could argue, regaining a role and a stature that over the course of history has been much more typical for them. You can argue that the last century and a half, in fact, have been an aberration if you look at Chinese history. I don't view the rise of one nation as inherently meaning others lose. I'm interested in figuring out, so let's not waste our time trying to figure out how we stop the growth of China, how we contain China. My view is that is a losing strategy. And that is a strategy that is also not consistent with history. It argues to me that there's not a high probability of success if somebody decided they want to go down that road. I think a much smarter strategy is, so given that growth, given that rise, how can we work together collaboratively to ensure that the growth is done in a way in which it becomes a part of the greater, broader world order, and that it is done in a way that optimizes outcomes both for China and its neighbors, to include the United States. That we shouldn't approach this as it's a zero-sum game. One's got to win and the other's got to lose. I never believed that. And I never thought that that was a smart way really to use as a prism to assess what will be one of the most, I think, for both our nations. Our respective relationships with China are going to be fundamental to our competitiveness and our ability and our economic performance in this century. You can't pretend otherwise. So given that, how can we spend our time thinking about how can we work together as they grow? Let's not fight that growth. Let's focus on how do we ensure that our core values are both protected as well as our economic competitiveness, and that we're not forced. The other thing that I always concern about is, look, don't get this into a situation where a nation feels they have to choose between a relationship with China, for example, and a relationship with the United States. My view is that is the wrong way to look at this. I won't speak for my nation, I'll only give you my opinion. I am no longer in government service. But I don't want to force another nation, if I can avoid it, to choose between us and something else, particularly when that something else is so vital to their economic growth, to their economic performance as a society. I'd like to figure out, hey, how can we work together vice forcing someone to choose? That's a tough choice to make. Now, sometimes you make that choice. 5G is a reflection of that. You step back, you assess the risk, and you decide, hey, look, we're not comfortable with the risk, so in this one particular area, we're not going to do it. On the other hand, I don't want this to become something broader where Australia feels, for example, it has to choose between one nation and us, or quite frankly, the same thing for us. We have been mates for a long time. I don't want to lose that. I think there's something incredibly powerful in that. That really segues me then into the last comment I wanted to focus on, the U.S.-Australian relationship. I think if we're honest with ourselves, we have tended to take this relationship for granted for some time. And my view is that isn't going to work for us anymore. Each of our nations must indicate and work with its population, with its citizens, to highlight the value of this relationship so that our citizens feel, hey, look, that relationship we have with America, with Australia, it's a good thing for them, it's a good thing for us. And it's not just some poster or some slogan I've heard about for the last 50 years. Rather, it is something real, it is something tangible, and it is something that is generating benefit today, not just over the course of the last 100 years. Even as we don't want to forget that 100 years. As a military guy, I think it's a great indicator that when we first started working together, arguably 100 years ago in the First World War, the first tactical employment of U.S. military forces on the Western Front was under the control of an Australian general, the good John Monash. That's not by chance to me. I'm thinking, you think about how far we have come from that. Every world war, every major global conflict, we have been together. In the post-9/11 environment, we have been together. Everywhere I have been on the battlefields in Afghanistan and Iraq in my professional career, I have loved hearing the sound of an Australian accent in the middle of nowhere in some really tough circumstances. That cheery "g'day, mate." I just really like that. I just think there's something really powerful about that. But we can't take this relationship for granted. We have to work at it, and we have to be able to articulate value. Because if we can't articulate value, it's a fair question from our citizens, so why are we doing this? We just can't keep doing the same things we've always done. That's going to take work. That means as government leaders, for example, we got to stand up and we have to publicly talk about, so why is there value? Why is this an appropriate choice for our respective nations? You can't just assume, well, don't worry, everybody knows our history. Everybody's going to love this relationship. Everybody's going to think it's a good thing. Because you've already seen that, I would argue, in the last few years, both here as well as our own nation. You have our respective populations questioning many of the long-term relationships our respective nations have enjoyed. You certainly see this in the United States. A questioning in some areas of, well, is it still relevant? Does it still generate value? Should we still be doing things the same way? I think that's a very fair conversation. I welcome that conversation. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to come down. It's one of the reasons why I'm part of the American-Australian Leadership Dialogue, for example. I just believe we got to work at it. Lastly, we're going to segue into questions and answers with Fergus. But the last thing I wanted to do was, I also wanted to thank ASPI for the International Cyber Policy Center. As I was talking to the team today, many of whom are with us tonight, who here is an ICPC professional? Come on, guys. Be loud, be proud, come on. I want to say thank you for inviting me to be part of the team for a little while, but more importantly, thank you for your willingness to help engage and spur thought in some incredibly demanding and challenging topics. Technology is going to be a core aspect of the future for us, and it's not just cyber, it's going to be technology writ large. I believe that we can assimilate this. Game-changing technology with social implications have been a part of man's history, our entire existence as a species. We just tend to think that the time we're living in is the most different or somehow the toughest. But it's not, in the sense that there have been game-changing technologies with potential negative second and third order effects throughout the history of man. We've dealt with it before. I believe we can deal with it now. But we got to be willing to sit down and think about this. And we really need to ask ourselves, what's the way forward? So let me conclude before Fergus comes up by saying, look, where I started talking about technology, in the end, to me, it's all about developing a strategy. I am watching other nations develop strategies, and I'm saying to myself, where is ours? How did we get ourselves in this situation? And what are we going to do so that we can compete against that strategy? I don't want to sit here and rail against the strategy, and as frustrating as parts of it are, theft of intellectual property, the mandatory sharing of intellectual property. If you want to do business there are aspects that I fundamentally disagree with. But on the other hand, I acknowledge we would be better served to focus on developing our own strategy than just, mindlessly berating, boy, we're just so frustrated we don't like. We can do that, but I'd really like us to channel our efforts into, so let's think about the strategy we're going to develop. Let's think about how we're going to compete. Let's think about how we're going to ensure our continued strong economic performance, our strong technological edge. How are we going to retain that? And at the same time as we're retaining that, how are we going to retain the values of the societies that we're a part of? This free, open expression. Even as we acknowledge, look, there's others who would turn that technology against us. Christchurch, Russian interference in our election cycle in 2016, we got some really important issues we need to be grappling with. With that, I'll shut up, and I look forward to your questions. All right, Fergus.
Admiral, thank you so much. It's always such a privilege to hear you speak, and just the breadth that you cover and the way that you engage an audience, I think, is just incredible. So thank you very much. There's a lot of technology people from the tech sector here tonight, so I wanted to begin with a question on that theme, and a little bit of a cheeky one.
Use that microphone, I'll steal this one.
As somebody who's spent their career breaking into other people's networks, is that becoming a tougher or an easier job? And by extension, is security getting better or worse? What's the trend there?
So in fairness, to answer the question, I tell people, look, in the course of my 37-year career in the United States Navy, I was part of teams or did this myself. I defended networks, I defended weapon systems and platforms, I defended data concentrations, I penetrated networks, I penetrated weapon systems and platforms, and I went after data. I worked encryption, both in terms of a technical development. NSA developed all the encryption, both the algorithms as well as the actual encryption products for all the classified systems, to include the nuclear piece in our own government, our own military. I was part of the government policy side, so I found myself from a practitioner at the same time as a senior, as a 4-star, working in the policy with the senior-most leadership of our nation. And in the midst of all that, I was working with my international teammates as well as working with industry leadership in the United States. And now I find myself working with industry as a private citizen. So I've looked at this problem set, as I tell people, boy, I've looked at this from a whole lot of different angles. The positive side is the defensive capability from a technical standpoint is improving. The recognition of the importance of the problem set, both within the government and in the private sector, is growing. The two concerns I always had was, number one, it's just easier to penetrate than it is to defend, to be honest. Because quite frankly, the advantage you have as an offensive actor in this is humans are imperfect, and so you count on user behavior that is just poor hygiene. No matter how great your system is, if you've got poor users. And it doesn't mean they're poor because they're bad people. In my experience, I found people want to do the right thing. They define the right thing, though, often as I want to be as fast, as efficient as I can in executing the outcomes of whatever organization I'm a part of, which means at times I'm willing to make shortcuts, I'm willing to change configurations, and I'm willing to bypass security. As an offensive individual, I'm thinking, I love people like you. And so you have to still acknowledge, which is one of the reasons why I would say, look, the key to defense is not just technology, it is also the human side. And lastly, and this is an argument I used to make in our system pretty hardly in 2 different administrations, we have got to change the dynamic. If we're just going to focus on the defensive responsive strategy, it's a losing approach. We're time late, we're always reactive, it's going to cost us billions, and I can't human capital our way out of this. It's not a good model for us. The bigger thing, I think, in the long term is, so how do we shape the risk calculus of cyber actors, whether they be nation states, non-state actors like criminals? How can we convince them, hey, look, you might be successful, but despite that, this is not in your best interest. That in the long term, the price you're potentially going to pay in no way justifies this kind of tactical activity we're watching, where you're going after our election systems, you're going after our key critical infrastructure, you're going after core intellectual property. We have to change the dynamic in their calculus.
Well, I wanted to open it up to questions from the floor. If anyone's... David, yes. Just down.
Wait, there's a microphone coming.
Thank you, Fergus. Thank you, Admiral, for that fascinating talk. I'm David Fricker, the Director General of the National Archives of Australia.
David.
Look, I'm really taken by your opening statement about looking at this situation with China not as enemies but as competitors, and sort of using that as a starting point to resolve differences. But I'm just really interested in hearing from you, if we're competitors, what do you think we're competing over? You know, what is the competition? Is it democracy? Is it treasure? Is it territory? You know, what do you think we're competing about? And secondly, what's our competitive edge? Where do you think we start to look?
So I would argue we are competing across a spectrum of things, from economic performance and growth. You could argue the territorial piece. You see that playing out in the South China Sea, the Senkakus, Taiwan. Although, again, I remind people, look, the United States has no interest in territorial expansion. That's not what we're about. Our argument is we need a governing set of principles that are applied uniformly around the world and should be done in a way that all of us feel comfortable with, and not in an arbitrary single nation decides, I don't care about legal frameworks, I don't care about the law, this is mine, that's enough. You know, we reject that generally. The issue, for example, on the economic competitiveness is, if you look at the ongoing trade discussions for the U.S., I mean, having worked directly for 2 presidents and been in the Oval and in the sit room with them, where we would sometimes talk about these things, I mean, the mantra I would always hear was fairness, fairness, fairness. Can't we create an environment where we can compete fairly? Hey, we allow another nation to bring a diversity of economic products to sell in the United States. Why can't we do that in their country? Why are there these huge tariffs imposed in some areas, not all, in some areas where we are granted authority to actually import, for us export, for them import to their country? Why are there significant tariffs imposed that no longer make us economically competitive? Hey, you let us into the market, but then you impose a tariff that puts such a price on the good or service, we can't compete. Your citizens won't buy it. How do we address that? How do we address this idea, for example, of, well, if you want to have a business in my country, you have to surrender your intellectual property. You have to create subordinate elements that are national companies for me, not for you. We're arguing, we don't ask you to do that in the United States. Why would you expect us to do that? Can't we get to this idea of fairness? Well, David, what was the last part again? So what's our competitive edge? I would argue, number one, our values. The idea of freedom, the idea of the choice of the individual, the idea of the private sector's ability to compete without the constraint of the government. I would also argue the power of innovation is one of our edges. that still, I would, one of the reasons why, quite frankly, you're seeing other nations, to include China, steal intellectual property in such a massive level, is because I think they've come to the conclusion, part of their strategy is, we're probably not going to out-innovate them right now, at least, and we want to save a lot of time and we want to save a lot of money. So one way to do that is, let's go steal the cutting-edge intellectual property. Let's steal that competitive advantage. So I think, again, if we can get to a level playing field, then our inherent advantages, that structure, that those values, that ability to innovate, I am really comfortable with the idea of, look, if we make it a level playing field, I believe we can compete with anybody. And again, as our society teaches you, competition is good, embrace it. I'm like, hey, that's what we should be doing. Nobody should be granting us a free check, a free ride. We have to compete. We have to earn. We have to outcompete the other. So,
Caroline.
Thank you very much, Admiral Rogers. Very interesting,
Hi,
as
Caroline.
always. Look, two questions. Firstly, I wonder what your advice would be to democracies. It seems to us in some ways that totalitarian dictatorships have a bit of an advantage here. They can compel businesses to do things. We can't. And you talked about the importance, in your speech and in the answer to the last question about the vital partnership between government and the private sector. Clearly that's essential, but how would you advise a democracy on how to approach building that partnership? Second question, you talked about the US-Australia alliance and not taking it for granted. I spent almost half my career working on this, and I would be very interested in your perspective as an American about what you see are the challenges and why you think we have to work on those. What are the things we need to work on together?
So let me do the second part first. One of the challenges, I see many people paint this choice as, if we retain our close relationship with the United States, we're going to be forced to choose between that and China. And China is such an economic engine for us that that's a bad choice. I reject that premise personally. I'm going, look, I don't believe in that premise, but I hear that. And my view is, so we need to have a discussion about, well, why don't we agree with that? You can accept it, or if you reject it, I reject the premise. So what do you think is an alternative? In terms of the first question, boy, this is something I feel real strongly about. I'll tell you a discussion I had one time. I was in 06, so a colonel or a captain of the Navy, a colonel in the other services. And out of the blue, kind of, I get grabbed by our chief of defense, our chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who I didn't know. He hires me, I'm a captain, and he tells me, Mike, I want you to be my thinker. I want you to travel with me wherever I go. I want you to sit in all my meetings, and I want you to think about the things that I'm not thinking about, but I should be. And I want you to help me tie all these individual dots together as I'm bouncing around my schedule. And I'm just thinking to myself, geez, how could he pick a guy like me to go do this? But I still can remember a discussion one day. We're talking about, it's post 9/11. It's within the first 18 months or so of the event. And the anger and the frustration is still very visible. And we're still, for example, we're working in the Pentagon, but we're rebuilding parts of the Pentagon that were destroyed in the events of that day. And my boss, the chairman, is the principal military advisor to the president and the Secretary of Defense in our Congress, is going across the river, as we say, crossing the Potomac, going across the river for a dialogue in the White House, and he is going to be talking about what the U.S. strategy should be in Iraq and Afghanistan as we're trying to work our way through how we're going to respond. And I said to him, and I thought to myself, man, he might cut my head off. But I said, sir, you told me you wanted me to be thinking about things. Sir, I would just urge you as you get ready to go over there today, there's likely to be a significant policy decision that may involve the employment of U.S. forces and that potentially could lead to loss of life. The one thing I would urge you to consider, sir, and not that he needed me to tell him this, but I thought, hey, this is what he's paying me for. Sir, if we compromise who we are and what we are in the name of our security, then the freaking bastards have won. We cannot allow ourselves to be dragged down to this level, as frustrating as it is, as emotional. I mean, I'll be very honest with you. I still cannot watch visible images of the tower falling. It just, my think of all those people dying. I think of all those individuals who just went to work in a free society one day and who never went home. And it wasn't just Americans, it was from people from around the world. And as visceral as that is to me, and as frustrated as it is, and as much as it motivated me for the rest of my career to ensure those individuals were held accountable, I often, however, thought to myself, but we can't become like them in order to defeat them. So the first thing I would say to any democracy, any society, is don't lose your values in the name of your own security or in the name of national policy. The last point I would make, having said that, I think one of the biggest challenges we're going to have to deal with in this digital age is how do we acknowledge that there are groups and individuals out there who are turning those freedoms against us, and therefore what is appropriate with respect to dissemination of information. I don't want to go to the authoritarian state. On the other hand, I look at a Christchurch scenario and I say to myself, I do not believe it is in our society's best interest to allow people who are perpetrating violence to try to glorify it or try to export it to others. I feel comfortable with the idea of we should not be putting that up on social media. We should not be allowing hate groups. We should not be allowing those who would incite and use violence as the means to address their particular viewpoint. We need to have a real discussion about that as in democracies around the world, because right now technology is outstripping our legal framework, and we really got to have a conversation about that. So,
We have a question over here, Jamie.
Hello, Admiral. Jamie Tarabay from the New York Times.
hey,
How are you?
very good.
Excellent. I want to sort of stay in that part of the world if I could. There have been a couple of anomalies lately, denial of service in some electric grids in 3 American states lately, and several years ago the Department of Homeland Security acknowledged that Russia was trying to infiltrate the electric grid. I think my question is really, has the US responded by probing the Russian grid? Would that work as a deterrent? And if you haven't been in the grid, why not? Thank you.
Let's ask an easy question that Rogers is obviously just going to expound on. So I am not. I never did when I was in government, and I'm not going to do it now. I'm never going to talk about anything that's classified or specific responses. Let me just say this. We have publicly acknowledged, and in my previous life, I actually provided capability to work with the private sector and the generation of power to drive nation states out of portions of the grid. So I've actually done this working with individual companies in addition to working the policy issues. My thought was this goes to a couple things. Number one, we got to come up with a better real-time partnership between critical infrastructure and the government. I thought at times our view was, well, we'll just leave it up to the private sector to deal with this, and then we'll kind of get involved if we become aware of something or if they need help. And I just thought that's not really going to get us where we need. We need a much more integrated real-time approach to how we're going to do this, number one. Number two, as I said previously, we need to also, particularly as the government, not the private sector, particularly as the government, we need to be thinking about, so what can we do to change the Russians' risk calculus here? What are the capabilities, what are the tools, what are the options available to us? They include cyber, economic things, diplomatic things. There's a whole lot, criminal. There's a whole lot of things we can do that can send a clear message to any particular nation state that, hey, we want you to know we have a level of awareness of what you're doing, that what you're doing is unacceptable, and we're prepared to make you pay a price for what you're doing. And therefore, it is in your interest to stop doing it. You saw us do that. I won't talk about the specifics of the power grid, but you have heard us publicly acknowledge that for the 2018 election cycle in the United States, we took some specific actions designed to preclude the Russians' ability to repeat what we saw in 2016. I thought that was a great step. I thought it had a measure of success and execution, which is always good to see. So I think there's some models out there that can show we can try to change the dynamic, if you will. Because it's interesting, it's a little bit of a riff off this, but we tend to focus on cyber as something that differentiates our nations. On the other hand, I think to myself, cyber is so ubiquitous. Couldn't we get to a scenario over time where cyber is actually something that brings us together to deal with a common challenge that we all have. Look, and cyber is a challenge for every nation in the world. If you're in Beijing, if you're in Moscow, you're having these exact same conversations, I bet. So my view is I'd love to get to a situation where over time, we use this as a vehicle to actually bring a broad range of nations together as opposed to arguing, hey, this is a way to differentiate ourselves, if that makes sense.
That's a fabulous lead into my question. Thank you for a fabulous talk, Admiral. I'm Tanya Munro, Australia's Chief Defence Scientist. I have a question for you really around your concept of levelling. One thing we do very well together between our nations is cooperate in science projects. And in fact, much is made of science and science diplomacy, science as an international language. Do you think that we could be doing more with science and research to play a role in the levelling you describe?
So the short answer is yes. That's why I said, look, there's no one particular answer to this. It's how about how we bring this disparate set of capabilities and groups together. So the short answer is yes. Now, I would also argue, boy, you can see other nation states, particularly the authoritarians, already going down that road where they're harnessing the power of their government defense and more broadly, other aspects of their technological and national laboratory structure to work on problem sets that they then pass on to the private sector to generate, competitive advantage in the business and the economic area. So my argument would be, yes, we need to do this. And, one of the things I loved in my previous life was spend a lot of times, for example, in the U.S. structure with our national laboratory. Oh, man, that was in the United States, our national laboratory structure is such a huge advantage for us. Totally unrelated, and this is probably unprofessional, but those who have seen me in Australia know I love movies. So as soon as you said to myself, you're a scientist, if you're a Ghostbuster fan, Peter Bankman, character's name, says, back off, man, I'm a scientist. I just always wanted to say that in a public gathering. What else? Got to be somebody in the back. There you go.
David Miller from ASPI. My question is in the 18th century, the East India Company, the Royal Navy, the Crown, the finance of the City of London got together to create a force in the markets in the East Indies. Why is it surprising to us that China can understand and learn from history and we apparently can't? And why would it be so hard, or what are the difficulties in doing the same thing very quickly?
So I would argue it shouldn't surprise us, but I guess the reason is because, quite frankly, for the last 50 years, we used a totally different model. And for the last 50 years, that model killed. It crushed. We gained economic advantage at a level that just led us to believe, hey, we don't need another model. This is working great for us. That, to me, is the difference. We went with a different approach. That approach worked really, really well. It generated huge economic advantage to us. But my question or my concern is, I'm not sure the model is really optimized for today. And so I think we need to think about a different model. And aspects of that model, as you've said, are things that we used to do in the past, that we used to think were very normal, very appropriate, and very historically apt. So it's not to me as if we're going to totally reinvent the wheel, but it is as if to me we got to step back and ask ourselves, this strategy is not optimized for today.